RESTful resource today. Ideally, we want to finish that. So there may be some things that you're just following along coding. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions about it. But again, I might not go as in depth without being prompted to. Okay, so I'm just going to try to plow through a lot of this stuff, and most of it should make sense. There'll be little intricacies that are a little harder. Let's see here. So share.
The video popped up on YouTube.
Okay. There you go. Let me know when the screen share actually happens to make sure I'm actually sharing my screen. Yeah. So again, what we've been gearing towards is we've been trying to build this RESTful resource, right? And the idea of a RESTful resource is, again, it's an object that in our case is going to be persistent, so it can be saved to the database, read from the database, updated to the database, all that kind of stuff like that. Your basic CRUD actions, right, with the database. So you have a model that we built, and we played around with the model, right? We used the Rails console to be able to create a new model, save that model to the database, read that model from the database, set its attributes, all this stuff like that, right? And what was nice is that the model was very simple code because we were given a lot for free, right? So what we were given, it's good, sweet, thanks. What we were building was this news post. And again, the news post looked incredibly bare. There was like no code in there, and that's because it's extending Active Record. And Active Record gave us a lot of stuff for free. So it looked at the database table news posts using Rails naming conventions. And because we're using their conventions, we don't actually have to configure anything. It just looks it up automatically. It's able to look at all those columns that are in that database table and automatically create getters and setters for all that, okay? So Natalia, this is why Ruby on Rails code is very hard to read if you don't understand, because there's nothing there, right? But it's very sweet if you do know what's going on, because you don't have to type anything, basically, right? So you'll learn a lot of that kind of stuff. And now your name's on the recording. So that's what we are doing with the model. Now, the whole thing with the model is, again, we got a lot of stuff for free in terms of saving it, creating it, destroying it. That was all built in for us. And now what we're doing is we're trying to build the front end web request response to interact with that model, right? We knew already that if we launched the Rails console, so we were playing around with the Rails console. And what we were able to do is we were able to do things like this, right? News post equals newspost.new. So it's just a constructor that we get. Actually, all Ruby objects have a constructor that looks like that. But the actual instance that we get, we're able to do a lot of things like set its title, set its body. Again, all these getters and setters we got for free. And then we can do things like save it. We can destroy it. And again, when you save it, it automatically creates the SQL statement to save that and go on from there. Okay. So we did all this in the Rails console. Now what we're doing is, now that we know how to interact and play around with this model, the question is, how do we do this through web requests and response? Because that's what your users are going to be doing, right? Your users are going to be going into the website. They're going to be filling out a form, creating a news post, and so on and so forth. So we did now again, this is structured around RESTful API conventions, okay? So it's like, if you have a resource like news post, you should use HTTP RESTful conventions to interact with that. So again, some of these conventions include, if you do get/news posts, you're going to be returning a list of news posts. If you do put/news post/ID, that's an update, and so on and so forth. Okay. So again, these are conventions that there's no way to logic them out. This is the way that the World Wide Web, developers have agreed upon. Okay. And that's what we're implementing. We're implementing that using Ruby on Rails. Okay. So where we got to last time is we did the very first one. So I kind of laid it out here that we were going to do the new, the create, the index, the show, the edit, the update, and destroy. And we got to the very first one, which was the index. Okay, so remember how to read this. This is the routes file under the config directory. You basically say, if I'm going to send a GET request to the URL /newsposts, that's going to forward to the newspost controller and then the index action of that controller, right? So that's how you read any route, okay? The type of the request, the URL that it's going to, the controller that request goes to, and its corresponding action, okay? So that's the very first one we did. And if we launch our Rails server, so just start a new tab. We launch our Rails server, you will see that if I go to localhost / news posts, okay, this is what we were rendering basically. So we were rendering the title and the body for every news post. Okay. Now, what I didn't get into too deeply last time, I kind of coded this as the last thing we did, but I didn't really go over how this was happening. So again, under the app controllers news post controller, we created this instance variable called news posts, right? Equals newspost.all. And in doing that, that at news post is available in the view, right? Anytime you want a variable from the controller to be available in the view, you create an instance variable, which is that @ sign, right? So any variable with the @ sign will be available in its corresponding view. So the corresponding view is views news post index, and this is how we used it down here. Okay, so this is the first time we saw mixing of Ruby control structures with HTML. And this is where Web 2.0 becomes really brilliant, right? Because no longer are you hard coding HTML, you're getting Ruby to do the heavy work for you, right? So this is a loop, right? This line up here and this line down here is enclosing the for each loop, okay? And then what's happening is for every news post, you're rendering this header 2 in this paragraph, and you're taking the title and the body of that, okay? And again, to read this, you're basically saying each news post that you loop through, we're going to assign it to the variable news post, okay? And then so within the loop, each news post is referred to by news post, okay? And then so we can do .title, .body for each one of those and go on and go forth, okay? So what should result is that if we have 3 news posts, is that this thing here should render 3 times filled in with the title and the body for each one. Okay, now remember, if you want the result of whatever you're processing in Ruby to actually output to the document, you have to have an equal sign there. But if you're using a control structures like if statements, loops, stuff like that, you don't want the equal sign there because you don't want the actual result of this loop to be output to the document. Okay, you're just using that as a control structure for the H2 in the paragraph tag. Okay, so a good way to check that is to actually view the source of your web page. So if I right-click this and go to inspect element or view source, okay, you'll see that what's happening here is there's the H2, there's the paragraph, there's the H2, there's the paragraph, there's the H2, that's the paragraph, okay? So remember, your browser doesn't understand Ruby. It only understands things like HTML, CSS. Later on, we'll learn JavaScript and jQuery, right? Only understands those client-side languages, we call it, right? So what Ruby does, again, that render function does, is the render takes that template and processes it, fills it out with actual text and HTML that the browser will understand, and then spit that back as the response to the request, right? And then now the browser can actually read that stuff and output that there, okay? So that's the very first thing we did. Okay, any questions there? Cool, okay, I'm gonna recode this a little bit because this isn't really typically what the index page looks like for a Rails resource. For news posts, it probably would be, to be honest, like a blog post, stuff like that. You probably would leave it this way. But I just want to show you a couple other things that we can do with this, okay? So let's recode this a little bit. Okay, so here, what I'm going to do is, first of all, I want to put this inside. I just want to style this a little bit better. It's kind of ugly right now. So if you guys go to your layout, application.html.erb, I'm just going to put a container around this. This is going to be really quick, lazy. So you just put a div container around the yield. All right, and what I'm going to do is, for the first time, I'm going to show you where to put your CSS. Okay, I don't know if I'll have time to get to this by the end of the course about the details of the asset pipeline, but for now, just assume that every CSS file you put in app assets style sheets is going to be on every single page. Just like every JavaScript you put in app assets JavaScript is going to be on every page. Okay. There are ways to fine tweak that, but again, let's just assume everything you put in there is going to be on every page. Okay. So style sheets. Let's create a new file under style sheets, and we'll call it let's say general.css.scss. Okay. This is just things that we're going to apply to every page. Okay, you can call it layout.css, you can call it base.css, whatever your convention is. Okay, and then make sure it's under app assets style sheets. Okay, so save it there. And again, this is just some really lazy layout right now. We're not. This isn't a course in CSS, so I'm just going to create a container class, give it a width of 960 pixels, give it a margin of 0 auto. What that does is, again, it centers. It basically creates a div, like a block of 960 pixels wide, and it centers it horizontally on the page. This is the top and bottom margin, 0. Auto is what makes it left and right centered. If you guys want more details on this, go view the CSS hangout that we did before the Christmas break. Okay. Now again, because you put it in this folder, it's going to be on every page. Okay, that's all you need to know for now. Okay, so if we refresh the page with that saved, okay, now it's a bit better. It's actually a 960 pixel wide container. It's a bit more centered now. Okay. All right, so now let's style these posts a little bit differently. Okay, so if we go back to the index, okay, you can get rid of the comments if you happen to have the comments there. Okay, this was just kind of our algorithm, our pseudocode before we got in there. You can get rid of those comments. Okay, so here we go. We are going to just style and restructure this news post. Okay, so it's a bit easier to read and to define everything. Okay, so what I like to do is, I mean, if you guys aren't familiar with div tags or span tags, you can think of everything you would ever want to separate, okay, logically, even in your head, that you can surround with a div tag. Okay, that's a kind of good rule of thumb that I like to use. When I start to lay out my page, I think about everything that I would ever want to separate. Okay, so like a news post from another news post, a news post header from its news post body, even in the body, the news post image from its paragraph text, and all this stuff like that, I generally put into a div. Okay, when in doubt, anything that you would think about separating, you put into a div. Okay, because div kind of gives you this arbitrary container around elements that you can style as a group. Okay, that's kind of a good way to look at it. So here, I want to style my news posts, and I want them to be in their own self-contained, their own kind of container. So I'm going to surround this with a div. Okay, and I'm going to call it. I'm going to give it a class of news posts. Okay, so in Sublime, when you're in an HTML file, if you type the tag and then the CSS selector, so in this case div, and then the CSS selector dot news post, and you hit tab, it auto creates a div for you with the class in there. Okay. Same thing works for IDs, for example. If you were to do something like this, like div dot news post, and then say primary news post. I never tried in multiples. Not quite. But I know it works with single. Either way, if that's not working for you, you can just fully type it out. These are just Sublime shortcuts. Okay, so let's do div news post. And again, the reason I use a class instead of an ID in this case is, think about it. We're looping over news posts, right? So there's a bunch of them on one page. And generally, IDs are reserved for something that is only one of on one page. Okay. In this case, there's multiple news posts. Each one of them I want to style together. So I assign a class to them rather than an ID. Okay. And then I'm just going to put all that code that we had in there into that news post. Okay. Now the reason I'm doing that is now I can style this news post kind of listing, right? This kind of one entry, and make it look a little bit nicer. Okay. So here we go. Under your style sheets, you should already see a news post CSS.scss. When we use Rails generate controller, it automatically creates a CSS file for you. Okay. Again, if you're not using generators, it's totally fine. You can manually add that in there. Okay. And the reason they do that is like, well, probably you want to style all your resources in one way, different from all your resources in another, right? So you have styling specific for news posts and styling specific for users, styling specific for products, and so on and so forth. Okay, so under news posts, I'm gonna do some styling on that news post class. All right, and all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give it a border. Okay, a light border. Give it a light background. Give it some padding all the way around it. And give it some margin between each news post. Okay. So we're going to put a 1 pixel border around every news post. We are going to make the background of that news post a light gray. And we're going to give it some padding, which means from the border to the actual content, it's going to be pushed in a little bit. And then the margin is between each element. So between each news post, we're going to give it 10 pixels above and 10 pixels below. Okay. Again, the way you always read 2 argument and 1 argument and 4 argument is like this. So if you were to specify 1 argument, it's all. If you were to specify 2 arguments, it's top and bottom and left and right. If you were to specify all 4 arguments, it's top, right, bottom, left. Start from the top and go clockwise. Okay, so because we're using 2 arguments, it's going to be the top and bottom and the left and right. Okay, we'll save that, and this is what you get. Okay, so you're gonna get, yes, question.
What's the difference between background and background color?
That is a great question. If I'm not mistaken, background can accept multiple arguments, not just color. It can accept like an image. It can accept kind of a lot. It's actually smart enough to understand a bunch of different types of backgrounds. Whereas background color is specifically color. So let's say you want to combine like a background image and a background color, you'd have to separate those 2 together. Whereas if you pass just a hex code to background, it knows it's just going to set background color. I think. I'm not 100% not sure on that, but I think that's pretty close. Okay, so you can see how a blog can actually come together, right? Which is really nice. Okay. So this is your blog post. I mean, again, you could have an image there if there are images attached to these things, and so on and so forth. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a seemingly useless page called the show page. Okay. The reason this is seemingly useless is because almost everything we want to know about these news posts is already there. So why would you want to view any more details about that news post? Okay. So this is more for illustrative purposes than actual usefulness in this case. I'll give you a more pertinent example. Say Facebook, right? Facebook, you're viewing a list of your friends, right? You go and one of the worst search algorithms, I don't know what they use, but when you go to find friends, they give you this random listing of your friends, right? Me and my buddy, we're so frustrated the other day. We're trying to find this one guy, and we're like, I have no idea how this search works. But what's interesting is they give you their little avatar, right? And they give you their name, and they probably give you a little friend status if you're friends with them or not, and a couple buttons. But that's it. They don't give you their likes, their interests, their feed. They don't give you anything, right? It's not until you actually click on that person that you get into their actual detailed page, right? That's the difference between index and show. Okay, index is your listing of all your resources, and show is the details of one specific listing. One specific instance. Okay, so blog post might be, okay, you see the blog post here, but when you click on it, you get to see when it was created, when it was last updated, who last updated it, maybe if there's a comments section. You don't get to see that until you get to the actual page itself. Okay, so that's how you view index and show. Okay, this is index, and then we're going to get to show. Okay, so again, in this case, we're not actually showing that much more information, but you can see the cases that you would normally do that. Okay. So we're going into our next action now. Now, again, we're going through the same routine for every one of these things that we do. Okay, so every one of these things that we do, we're going through. We are going through this idea. Where is it? That for every one of these kind of actions, we're creating a route, creating a controller action, and generating a response. Okay. Again, we did it with index. So we created this route, okay? Then we went into the news post controller action. So we created the action, and then we created the response. Okay, now again, we aren't explicitly creating the response here. Remember, you would have to explicitly, this is the explicit way of doing it. Okay, so render that view. But again, Ruby on Rails, by default, it always renders the same named view as its action. Okay, so because we've named the view index.html, we don't actually have to put this line of code here. It's automatically going to do that for us. But that's still effectively there generating the response. So now we're going to do that. I always forget the number. Is it 5, 6 more times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 more times. So 7 total actions. Okay. We're going to do this 6 more times in the next 45 minutes, and hopefully it will get done. Okay. It's going to go pretty fast. Again, some things we can get to if you guys ask me questions. And then one last thing I want to say before we get into this is the routes file is read in priority from top to bottom. Okay. So what happens is if it matches a route at the top before a route matches a route below it, your below one's going to be ignored. Now, how can that be, right? I mean, it's got to be the exact same like route for it to match 2 of them, right? That's because I haven't introduced you guys to dynamic variables in routes. Okay, it's possible to have a dynamic variable inside a route, and then that gets passed into your controller as a variable that you can use. Okay, and we're going to see that with the very next action. Okay, so the reason I tell you about this ordering is that I have new create, index, show, edit, update in this order, but we are going to be constantly rearranging that to match kind of RESTful API. Okay, and what takes precedence over the next one. Okay, so I might be copying and pasting these routes up and down. Okay, just so you know. Okay. All right, so the next one we're going to do is show. Okay, so show is also a get request, and the reason it's a get request is because we're not updating data, we're not destroying data. Okay, typically what they say in the web world is if you're doing a get request, you're simply reading information. Okay, so they say get is what we're going to use. This is what the route looks like. Okay, now this is the first time we've seen a dynamic route. Okay, so what this says is if anybody types in /newspost/ something, whatever it is, it could be anything. It could be a number, it could be a word, okay, it could be whatever comes after that slash, okay, match it to this route and pass in the ID as a variable that you can use inside your controller. Okay, that's what dynamic routes use. Okay, so the way you do a dynamic variable in a route is with a colon. Okay, you're basically passing it a Ruby symbol, is what it is. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that and we're going to forward that to the news post controller. Okay, and it's going to go to the show action. Okay. So do you guys remember how we actually do GET requests? There was 2 main ones we were able to do GET requests. Remember any examples of how to do a GET request? Like from your browser, I mean.
What's the URL?
One's the URL. Okay, so when you type in a URL inside the address bar, that is a GET request. Okay, there's another major one that was mentioned 2 weeks ago. Do you guys remember what it was? You got this.
I think you said it actually.
It's a link. Okay, so a link is another way to do a GET request. Okay, because a link effectively is whatever the href is in a link is you're effectively taking that and putting it into the URL address bar and submitting it. So I mean, really, of those 2, maybe there's only one, right? But a link is a shortcut to doing that. There are other ways to send GET requests, but these are the most common ones we're going to run into. Okay, so the way we test these, the easy way to test these is just to type them in. Okay, so let's take a look at this now. Show. Okay. Now, when I look at these two do not conflict with each other, okay? Because one is a news post with nothing following it, and one is news post with a slash and then something following it, okay? So I don't have to worry about the order of these 2 because they don't actually conflict with each other, okay? There will be some in the future that will, okay? All right, so news post ID. Okay, so here we go. Let's go to the news post controller. So the name of the action we said was show, okay? So we need to create a show action. All right. So again, an action is just a method inside a controller. All right. And just to show you how this ID works, I'm going to create a very simple page for you guys. Okay, so let's do this. At ID equals. Okay. Now every request in Ruby on Rails comes with a very special hash called params. Okay, it stands for parameters. Okay, and parameters actually holds a lot of information. Okay, it holds. The nice thing about it is that Ruby on Rails treats a whole bunch of different types of information, throws them all into a single hash called params, so you can use it really easily. Okay, one of the things it uses is your URL dynamic variables. Okay, so we have a URL dynamic variable that's going to come into this show action, right? Because we defined it in this route. So anytime we enter this route, we have this dynamic variable here, and the way that comes in to this controller is through the params hash. Okay, so you can just do the params hash and reference the key, okay, of that hash. So that's how you get it out. So whatever they type into that slash whatever is going to exist in that params ID. Okay, you're going to see that params is going to have a lot of extra stuff as well. It actually is where form data exists. It's actually where jQuery Ajax parameters exist. It's where, again, a couple other things as well that exist. But this is the first case of it. Okay, it's going to be a very powerful tool that we're going to use. Okay, so at ID, because it's an @ sign, we can use it in a view. So let's create a view. So again, under news posts, we're going to create it called show.html.erb. Okay, and that's because it's named the same as action, so we don't have to type render, right? Save us some typing. And so here, let's do this. So news post page for ID dots. We'll just create a header, and we'll create some lorem ipsum text in there as well. Okay, news post page for ID, whatever. Okay, so we haven't actually done anything to get this news post. All we've done is literally whatever they pass in, we're just echoing it out to the page. Okay, so let's see if that works. So if I type in just news posts, that route still works. So that's good, nothing's changed. But if I type in slash news post slash say hello, there we go, right? That ID got assigned to the instance variable, which was used in the view, and it's output there, hello, right? Let's say I was to say goodbye. There it is, okay? Let's say I was to say two there, right? And let's say I was to say something like news there, right? Or, I don't know, deletes there. It just gets passed right through. Okay. Now, that's not very handy. I mean, probably what makes most sense is that because you called it ID, right? If you're going to go slash news post slash ID, ideally it would show you the news post with that ID, right? That only seems to make sense, right? Again, this is stuff that web developers have thought out over and over again, right? So we're just following their conventions. So let's do that. Let's actually use that. Now that you've seen this ID in action, let's actually grab that news post with that ID. Okay, so we're going to use an active record method called find. Okay, so we have our news post class. Okay, it has a class method, or for Java developers, it's a static method. Okay, it's got a class method called find, and that takes in an ID. Okay, now we're not really assigning that to the ID anymore. Let's assign it to something called the news post. Again, as long as there's no ambiguity in Ruby, sorry, you don't have to actually put brackets for method calls. Okay, since there's no ambiguity here, you could technically do this. As long as there's a space. Okay. Yeah, Ruby again is one of those languages that's like so cool once you know it, but because it's so based on like knowing all the conventions that you forget things like spaces, all that stuff like that, it gets really, really hairy. Okay, so at news post. So now we actually have a news post instance, right? We actually went to the database, grabbed a news post with a certain ID, and spit it out at news post, right? I mean, that's the equivalent. See in our Rails console, that'd be the same thing as doing this, right? News post.find 2, right? So see what it does. It just does a select from that news post table, where ID is equal to whatever you passed in. Okay. You know, if you try to search for 3, look, it can't find it. Spit out a massive error, record not found. Okay. Great. So now we actually have the news post here. Let's use it now in our view. Okay. So in our view, okay, we no longer have this ID, but we have something called an @news post. Okay. And we can say it's ID. Okay, that doesn't seem to do much more than what we were doing before. But let's put some actual stuff in here. Okay, so we'll say here, let's do this. Its title was @newspost.title. Okay, its body was @newspost.body. Remember, we get some free fields here. Created at, updated at. Now these won't be very friendly in terms of date readouts, but we can format that later. Okay, this is just all the details about this post. Okay, so when we refresh the page, oh, what do we got here? Couldn't find news post with ID delete. That seems to make perfect sense, right? There is no news post with the ID delete. We have a news post with ID 1, I think 2, and apparently not 3. But we don't have one with delete, and that's why it's spitting back this error. Okay. So what about, let's try one with news post 1. And there it is. Okay. So your guys' databases might be different. You just have to find whichever one you have. Okay. But this, I mean, that's weird though. I mean, you probably would never ever go to a website and know the ID of a specific blog post or news post and type it into the URL. I mean, if you're a hacker, you might like start typing in random like things to see what you can find, right? But I mean, if you're just a casual browser, usually there's a page that gives you all those IDs, right? I mean, the worst, not the worst, but maybe the second worst web page would just list those IDs for you. You know, have a list of numbers and here's all of my news posts. You know, grab one of these numbers and type it in, and you'll get to this other page. Probably more helpful is a link, right, to that URL. Okay, so this is where we can link to these detailed pages. Okay, so why don't we do that? Okay, so now that we know that this is working, let's create a link from the index page, because the index page is probably a common place to go. It'd be common to go to /newspost or /blog post, but to feel the details of an individual one, let's go to that. Okay, so let's go back to our index. Here we have our news post. Okay, so here, let's just create a link. Okay, now, typically we use this for link, right? More and more as we go through the next 5 weeks, you're going to find that Ruby on Rails has what we call view helper to create HTML elements. In some cases, they're literally just a more convenient way to type. But to be honest, in most cases, they do a lot more than that. Okay, they do a lot of things that are, they do a lot of automation for you. Okay, like for example, we'll get into creating a form later today. Okay, and to create a form in HTML, you usually create a action, which is like post or get or put or delete. You have to create a URL for that, and you have to make sure the URL is right. You have to create name fields and all that stuff like that for that, and to make sure they're all proper. If you hand code it, you have to know a lot of stuff about how Ruby on Rails works. If you use Ruby on Rails helpers to do that for you, you'll get all that for free. Okay. So again, it's one of the pluses and minuses of Ruby on Rails. If you're in a Ruby on Rails framework, it's very nice because you just have to use these helpers and they generate nice, secure code for you, right? But if you're trying to integrate with another backend or something like that, then all of a sudden, like things fall apart, right? And you have to kind of manually know all this stuff. Okay. Okay. So here I'm going to introduce you to one of the most used view helpers, and that's link to. Okay. Link to generates an ahref. Okay, it ultimately spits out an ahref, but it's powerful in the sense that you can pass it a lot of different types of arguments that ultimately end up generating an ahref. Again, it does it in a smart way. Okay, so here, what we're going to do is we are going to say link to. Okay, so it's a method. Okay, and the method takes in 2 arguments. Okay, it takes in the text and the href. Okay, so the text is going to be, say, show details, and the href. Okay, for now we're just going to code it like this: news posts slash the ID of that specific news post that we're on in this iteration. Okay, so we're going to use string interpolation in this case. Okay, so that's the hash sign with the curly braces. Remember, anytime you want to insert like a variable inside a string, okay, you can use this kind of notation. You can also use plus for concatenation. Works the same way. This, I find it's just easier to read. Now we can put a variable in there. So in this case, we're going to do news post .id. Okay. We'll see later. There's an even easier way to express this, but I don't want to tread on it quite yet because I'm already breaking a Ruby convention a little bit right now. Okay, so show details. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Let's go back to our index page, so slash news posts. Okay, so that's pretty cool. We got our show details under every link now being generated. Now, if you right click and inspect the element, you'll see what each one of these looks like. Okay, so for the first one, it's slash news post slash 1, right? For the second one, it's slash news post slash 2. Okay, so we're dynamically generating these links, and I'm guessing this one's 4. Yeah, you can see it right there on the. So slash news post slash 4, because somewhere along the line I deleted a news post. Okay, so there we go. We have these show detail links, and because of links by default they use a get method. So if I click on that link, it should bring me to the show page of that news post, right? Okay, so show details brings me to that. Okay, news post page for IT2, and so okay. So you can see how you can have a list of users here. Click on them, it gives you to the users page, right? Okay, now one last thing I want to do so it's easy to navigate around. On the news post show page itself, okay, I'm just going to add a link at the bottom. Say back to news posts. Okay, and that's going to go to slash news posts. Okay, so now what we have is when we go here, you can navigate back and forth. Okay. All right, motoring on because we're running out of time. All right, so that's index and that's show. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to do new, how to create a new page. Okay, there's going to be a lot of code here. Okay, so follow along with me. Okay, first of all, new. Looks like that as its route. Okay, now remember, there are 2 parts to new. Okay, sorry, I should say there's 2 parts to create. Okay, one is presenting a form to the user so they can fill out the information, and the second request is actually submitting that form to create the record. Okay, so there's 2 parts. Same thing with when we do updates. Update will have an edit form and the actual update request. Okay, so there's always 2 parts to these. Okay, so new is the piece where we're actually just presenting the user a form to fill out, and create is the actual request to actually take that information and create a news post from that. Okay, so it's going to be slash news post slash new, and that's going to forward to the news post controller, and it's going to be to the new action. Okay, are there any route conflicts? No. There actually is, well, I guess it depends on how you word my question or how you interpret my question. There is a route conflict, but we're in an okay position right now. Okay? Because technically new and show have the same form, right? Like if there really was a news post with ID new, we could no longer hit that, right? Because we're reading from top to bottom. It's going to hit this route before it hits this route, okay? Now, we're safe in this case because we're saying that all news post IDs are integers. So you would never have an ID with new in it. Okay, but that won't always be the case. Okay, there could be a case where you say, what if you want to say /newspost/title? Okay, that's the way you access it. Okay, maybe IDs are not that friendly. Maybe you want to access it by some slug, okay, like some like dash version of the title or whatever, right? And let's say one of the titles was new, then you would never hit it, right? You'd always hit that first, right? So you never get the show page of that. In this case, we are okay. So again, it depends how you interpret my question. In this case, we do want, if new is typed in there, to go to the new page, okay, and not go to the show page, okay? So we're safe in this case. Okay, let's do this. So again, go through the same routine, go to the news post controller, find a new method, okay? And then we go to the view, and we define a new.html.erb. Okay, and let's just create a header. So creating a new news post. Okay. Now, here's where a bunch of new code is going to hit you guys. Okay, and again, in the given time, I'm just going to type it out. You guys are going to have to follow along, take it for granted, and if at the end we have some question time, we'll get to it at that point. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do here is in the new. Okay. We are going to create a temporary in-memory news post, okay? So the way we do that is just like how we did it in the Rails console, we call .new. Remember, this was in memory. It wasn't until you called .save that it actually created a SQL statement and wrote it to the database. This was just an in-memory instance of this, okay? Now, the reason we're signing to at news post is what we're going to do there is we're going to use that to build our form, okay? And this is where Rails gets pretty fancy with its helpers, okay? So if we go to the new page, we are going to create a form, okay? And it looks like this. There's a method called form4 that takes in an active record object, okay? So our active record object happens to be this news post. This blank, empty news post that we just created, okay? And what it takes in is a method, block method, that spits out what we call a form builder. Then what you can do is you can use that form builder to create your fields, okay, and your labels. Okay, so I'm going to create a field here. Okay, just an empty div to surround my fields, just for styling purposes. Okay, get some styling here. And the last one we'll call action, even though it's basically just another division for styling purposes. Okay. Okay, now the form builder that gets spit out from this form4 method, okay, is it allows you to basically create labels and text fields and checkboxes and all that stuff like that based on the fields that exist on that instance. Okay, so at news post we have a title, we have a body, we have created at, we have updated at, we have ID. That form builder basically allows you to easily build labels and input boxes and all that stuff like that using that instance. And the reason we do it this way is because it's going to name everything properly for us, okay? So we're going to create a label. We use that form builder to split out a label, okay? And we're going to create a label for the title, okay? Then we're going to create a text field for the label. Okay. Normally in HTML, you'd be typing this out something like this. Okay, the HTML equivalent would look something like this. You'd be creating a label, okay, and it would be called title, okay, something like that. And then you'd be creating an input field, okay, and the input field would have a type of text, and it would have a name of something, 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 okay. That's what you normally would do in HTML if you've never done HTML before. We are going to use Rails helpers to do this for us, okay, and I'll show you what it ends up outputting, okay. Very good exercise, by the way, in Ruby on Rails is anytime you use Ruby on Rails helpers is to inspect your source when it gets spit back to you and see what it actually generates for you, okay. Because as soon as you learn that stuff, you learn how to manipulate Rails, actually. Okay, so let's do the same thing for the body. But for the body, I'm going to use a text area, just because it's bigger. It's, you know, you want to type more text. So I'll do an X text area for the body. And then we are going to do a submit button, okay, to submit this form. I don't know. Let's find out. /news/new. It does. There we go, created form. If you were to manually type this form, okay, you can inspect the element. This is what you would have to do. You would have to, one, okay, figure out what the method is and what URL it's going to go to, okay? It's a little bit confusing using action interchangeably all over the place, but HTML spec for a form says the URL that you're going to send a request to is the action of the form, okay? So this form is going to submit to the URL /newsposts, and it's going to submit to it with a post method, okay? We do not have a route for that yet. We have a route for get news posts, but we don't have a route for post news posts, so we're going to have to react to this somehow. So that's the first piece. The second piece you'd have to figure out is a bit of security that's going on in Ruby on Rails, which is a little bit outside the scope of this course. But Ruby on Rails adds this thing for security. Okay, and this basically prevents cross-site submits. Okay, so basically, no other site can submit to your website besides your site. Okay, that's not that important because that's not something you typically learn in HTML programming anyway. But what you do learn in HTML programming is creating the labels and the input fields. Okay, so you would have to come up with a label. Not a big deal. That's easy. But you have to come up with an input field, and you have to come up with a name for it. Okay, so you have to come up with a name for it. In this case, news post title. And then you'd have to remember that name when you go to respond to this thing. Okay, again, Ruby on Rails packages up in a conventional way. So it says, okay, what we're going to get in here is news post brackets title. And you'll see what happens to that when we actually go into the post, okay? It has to be named this way for Ruby on Rails to understand what it's going to do with it once it submits, okay? And then the action is just a submit button. If you get in the habit of using the Rails form builders, okay, you don't have to worry about all that naming. It'll come to you automatically over the other, okay? Using a convention that you'd probably use anyways, okay? And again, this is my whole argument for convention over configuration programming, is it makes you a better programmer because it's like you start to learn the conventions because you have motivation to do it, which is like your motivation is less coding. If I code this way, I have to code less, right? And that's your big motivation. Versus, again, I gave a talk where I was saying like, usually the motivation is your boss is saying, do this convention. That's not really much motivation. The motivation here is you actually type less, which is really nice, okay? That is our form, okay? It's done. So that's pretty sweet. So again, when we go /newspost/new, it doesn't get mistaken for the other one because it hit this one first, right? Hit this route first. That's why I didn't try to go to the show, right? If I type in 1, that no longer matches that /new route, right? So it finds the next matching one, which is ID, right? Okay, so let's create a link to this page from the news posts index. Okay, so we have all these news posts here. Let's just create a little link at the top there. So where is that? That's in the index. So just above our list of news posts, let's create a link to new news post. And that is what? /newspost/new, right? Okay. So now it's there. So I'm gonna click on here. We get to our post here. Okay. You guys do have internet right now? Okay, we're gonna try something. I don't know how long this is gonna take. Hopefully it won't take that long. Go to your gem file. Okay, and anywhere really. Just type in gem pry. Okay, you're gonna install a new gem that's gonna help us basically debug code. Okay, and you can assign it to the development group. Okay, gem pry, group development. Once you have that, stop your Rails server. Wherever your Rails server is running, just hit Control-C and stop it. And just run bundle. Bundle is short for bundle install. Okay, and that should install pry. Because we're going to kind of step through what's going to happen here. Now, pry basically allows you to insert breakpoints into your code. Okay, because it's a scripting language, it's not a compiled language like Java, C#. We don't inherently have that. Okay, what this allows you to do is actually stop execution of code. It's not as fancy as full debugging, like where you can step over stuff and stuff like that. But you can basically pause the code and start inspecting stuff and play around with code there. Okay. If it's not working right now, it's not a big deal. You can still follow along with what I'm saying. If it's not working, just remove that line and restart your Rails server. Okay. Okay, so what I want to do is explain to you what happens when we hit the submit. Okay, remember when you click on a link, that sends a GET request to a specific URL? Okay, this is pretty new. When you submit a form, it's also sending a request, just like any other web request. Okay, it's still the request response. Okay, but what it's doing is sending a new type of request called post. Okay, and really that's just semantics, which means, I mean, it's no technologically different than a GET request. Okay, it's just on the other side, you're going to respond differently to it. Okay, so you could technically submit a form with a GET request, but again, it's a nice way to differentiate between the two. Okay, like if you're submitting a form, we're going to use post. If you're submitting, a URL type in, that you're using a GET request. Okay, so again, technologically, there's nothing different. It's just semantically. In other words, the meaning on how we interpret it is going to be different. Okay, it's going to send a post request. But here's the other really cool thing that it does. It carries along with it data, okay? Now web requests, remember when we did /newspost/ID? The ID was a piece of data that came along with it, right? There's other ways to submit information, by the way, with a GET request. Post, what happens is when you post a form, so if you have a form tag and you have input fields or whatever, checkbox fields or anything in between that form, and you hit submit, along with that request is going to come all that form data. Okay, we typically call this posting a form. Okay, posting a form to a URL. Okay, but basically all this means is you're sending a request to a URL, and along with it, you're sending all this form data. Okay, so let's create a route to handle that. Okay, so this is going to be in the create. So this is our first post request. Okay, now this is really not going to conflict with anything because there's no other post requests, right? Everything else is a GET. And we're going to post it to news posts, okay? Anytime you're posting to the news posts URL, okay, we are going to call the news post controller and the create action. All right. So again, this is RESTful API conventions, okay? Usually when you work in a company and you're integrating with another company's software and you ask them, do you have a RESTful API? This is what you're talking about. In other words, let's say they had products. Do they have a RESTful API to their products? Does that mean, do they have a post request / products? Do they have a GET request / products? So on and so forth, okay? All right, so post, news post create. Oh, sorry, that's a typo. Should be news posts, right? Because we have a news post controller. Okay, so let's go to the controller and create its action as well. Okay. Now, here's where I want you guys to use binding.pry. By installing that pry gem, you have this ability to put this piece of code anywhere in your execution, okay? Anywhere from the route to the ERB to anything, and it'll stop at that, okay? So be very careful when you ship code to get rid of that, okay? Because the worst part is if you don't have, because we specified in development, it doesn't just stop, it spits out an error and says something has gone wrong, right? Which is not very pretty. It's like debugger in Chrome, actually, when you put that in. Okay, binding.pry, okay? So let's try this out. So if we type in, okay, Oscar night was great, and we say, I don't know, Birdman1. Okay, and we create this news post. It's going to send a request, a post request, hit our create action, and then stop at binding.pry. Okay, so when I do this, this just hangs forever, waiting for that response to come back because we're stuck now. Okay, Chrome will probably time out at some point, but your Rails server is constantly paused there. Now, if you go back to your Rail where you launch Rails S, you should actually see it stopped. Okay. Now, the reason I wanted to stop it there is because I wanted to show you guys what you have available for you here. Okay, and where this post data comes in. Okay. Remember, as a params is going to be a very important thing that we use. Okay. Params takes in dynamic URL variables. The other thing it contains is form data. Okay, so what Ruby on Rails does for you is it takes all your dynamic variables in your routes, and it also takes any form data that's coming along with it and puts them into the exact same hash. So you don't have to do any massaging. You don't have to look at the request that came in. You don't. It just throws it all into this params hash for you to use. Okay, so if you type in params, you'll see what came along with it. Okay. So what came along with it is there's this authenticity token. Okay, there's an action and a controller that came along with it. There's a commit. I don't know what these are even for, but then there's this news post here. Okay. So what's really cool about this actually is that the way that news post came in is it didn't come in as news post square brackets title equals something, news post square brackets body equals something. Rails actually broke this out into a hash for you. Okay, like it actually took all your parameters and threw it into a hash called news post, and the keys of that hash are title and body. Okay, which is really nice because again, you don't have to do any of this massaging. Okay, and this is why I say use form for, because it'll name it in a way that Rails understands to create a hash that way. Okay. And the reason this is nice is because one, well, Ruby on Rails uses hashes everywhere, but there are methods that take in a news post as a hash to create a news post for you. Okay, rather than you saying news post.new and then news post.title equals this, news post.body equals this, you can just pass in a hash and it'll create it for you. Okay, so this is a really handy way to work with those parameters. It already throws it to a hash for you, and there are methods that take in a hash as a parameter that you can work around. Okay, so we're just going to type in exit to get out of the breakpoint. Okay, and it's just going to give us some error because we didn't actually do anything with that. Okay, so go back to newspost/new. Okay, and I'm going to teach you what to do with that params hash. Okay. Now, the first time we're going to do this, we are going to get an error, which is going to lead into something called strong parameters. I don't think we're going to get done today, but I will. We're going to get close. Okay, so what we're going to do is there is a method on Active Record called create, I believe. Let me just double check this. Oh, you can do it with .new. Okay. So remember how I said you can create a news post like this? Okay, that creates you an empty news post. That .new, it's an empty constructor that exists on every class, not just Active Record, right? Now, what Active Record gives you though is you can pass in a hash into this. Okay, that looks like this. You can pass in a hash that looks like this. And it'll create that for you and set those properties for you. Okay, that's what you can do in Active Record. Okay. Now, I don't know if any of you guys are asking this, but it's a good question to think, why are we recreating this post when we created that post in the new, right? Isn't it there, right? Well, the reason is, the way you have to think about Ruby on Rails is that in memory, every request is independent, okay, or stateless. Okay, from request to request, we actually don't have any notion of anything that happened in the past request. Okay, unless we pass that information to the web page and pass that all the way through and right? Okay, there is something called session, which we can deal with, but generally speaking, when these instance variables are created or whatever, we don't actually know about them from request to request. So that very first @news post equals news post.new, a lot of news in that. In that new action, okay, that @news post equals news post.new. We created that instance variable and sent it to the form and then rendered the page and the request was done. Okay? So this next action actually has no notion of that. Now, why did we do that? The reason we did that is we want to create this blank, empty object that Form 4 could use to create its input fields and all this jazz. Okay, that's the only reason we create @newsPost in that new action. Is to just have this dummy empty container to render the form. Okay, it allows us to render the form that way. Okay, now here we want to pass in a hash that's title, body, yada yada yada, with the information that we have. Okay. Now, if we look at our binding.pry, okay, params newsPost is a hash exactly what we're looking for. It's a hash that has a title as a key and body as a key. It's exactly what we're looking for. Okay, that's obviously not by accident. That's the way Ruby on Rails is designed, but it's handy. Okay, that hash is given to us like that. Okay, so if I were to do params newsPost, okay, what it would look like is this hash. Okay, which is exactly the hash we want to pass into here. Okay, so we can basically do params newsPost, and that will create the new newsPost for us in memory. Okay. Now, obviously, this is a create process, so we don't want it just in memory. We want to actually save it to the database, right? So what we can do is we can save it to the database. Okay. And here's something interesting we're going to do. @newsPost.save actually returns a Boolean. It actually returns a true or false to let us know if it was a successful save or not. Where might not be a successful save? If that record's invalid. Okay, we haven't talked about validations, but you can actually add validations on newsPost to say you must have a title, or you must have a body, or something like that, right? If you try to call .save on it, it'll say, no, it's invalid, I'm not saving this to the database, okay? So that'll actually return a true or false. So we can do something like this. Okay. So if it's successful, if @newsPost.save, in other words, if that equals true, okay, then we're going to do something. And otherwise, we're going to do something else. Okay. Typically, what we do is after you create a new newsPost, you just go back to the listing, right, where it's out there. So why don't we just do that? So go back to the index, let's say. And if it's not successful, you probably want to let the user know that it wasn't successful, and maybe give them the form again, right? Okay, we're going to deal with the second piece next week, okay? But in the last like 5 minutes or so, the first piece we're going to get through, okay? So the first piece, the first time we are not going to use Ruby on Rails convention. Ruby on Rails convention is that we create a page called create in the views, right? We call it create.html.erb, and it just naturally renders it, right? For the first time, we're going to break that convention. We're going to say, no, there is no create successful page. You can do that if you wanted. You could do a create successful page or something like that. We're just going to redirect back to the index page. Okay? So one of the very few keywords that interrupts a controller action is the word redirect. Okay, what a redirect does is any code that you have underneath it, it's going to completely ignore. It stops the code right there. Okay? And it's very important you understand what this is actually doing. Redirect to, you can pass it a URL. Okay, so we're going to pass it the index URL. What a redirect to does, okay, is it's going to cause the browser to actually make a subsequent request. Okay, that's very important to understand. So basically what's happening, so let's say me and Ryan are the browser and the server. Okay, so Ryan's the browser, I'm the server. So Ryan sends a request to me to create a newsPost. So that's where that block of code is, okay? So he sends an incoming request, and then I create a news post from that hash with this data that he passed me. Then I save it. The save is successful. And now I'm going to send him a response, right? Typically what that response is just an HTML page. That's what we've been doing all the time, right? An HTML page goes right back to him, and then it just renders it, right? In this case, what I'm sending as a response is a redirect instruction, okay? So what that means is I'm sending this little packet back to Ryan. Ryan opens up that packet and says, oh, redirect to news posts, which causes him to send another get request to news posts and go through that. Okay, the reason that's really important to understand is because it'll help you understand the flow of when we start to use render as well, a different kind of render. Okay, so what's happening is I send a redirect back to Ryan. Okay, and now he's going to send a completely separate get request to news posts, and he's going to go through the exact same. He's going to go through the index thing here. It's as if he typed in /news post again. Okay, so him hitting that submit button actually results in 2 requests actually taking place, 2 request responses actually taking place. Okay. That's what that redirect to is, okay? A lot of people have trouble understanding that redirect to because later on, I'll show you, we're gonna use something down here called render, which actually has completely different connotation than redirect to, okay? Even though they may appear to have the same kind of output, okay? So let's try to run this. This is not gonna work. I'll show you what's gonna happen. Okay, so go to the new page. Okay, so create a title, or let's create something better. Whiplash, awesome movie, news post, and this is what happens. We get a forbidden attributes error. This is a built-in security feature of Ruby on Rails. Okay, I am going to type it out right now because we only have like 2 minutes left, basically, and then I'll follow up on it next week. Okay, but I want to type it out so you guys can actually use this and play around with it. Okay, because we don't want to be left in a bad state before checking code. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a private method. Okay, we haven't done private methods before. The way you do private methods in Ruby on Rails, or sorry, just Ruby, is you just define a private keyword, and anything below that is private. Okay, not exactly the best because if you're way down at the bottom, you're like you missed a private keyword up there. It's a little bit annoying. Also, you like to indent this just so again as a little visual marker. Okay, and again syntactically it doesn't matter, but convention, okay? So we're gonna create a method called news post params, okay? That is a convention, but it's not a strict requirement, okay? You can name it whatever you want because you're gonna be using this yourself, okay? And then what you're gonna do is you're basically taking in the params, okay, that came in to you, okay? So this is just all part of the same request, okay? And what you're gonna do is you're gonna say those parameters have to have a news post item inside them. Okay, and from that news post item, we're only going to permit certain attributes. Okay, so we're going to permit the title. We're going to permit the title, and we're going to permit the body. Anything else that comes in, we're going to forbid. And this is a security feature because, like, let's say somebody was to send in, like, I don't know. Let's say we're doing users instead of news posts, and users had a column called admin, true or false. Right? You wouldn't want people to be able to send, even if your form doesn't have the admin true or false, you wouldn't want hackers to be able to send in an admin value and change the admin value of that user, right? Like that wouldn't be good. So this is what this is security basically allowing you saying only these are allowed in any hash that comes in. So if anything else comes in, ignore it. Okay, get rid of it. And the reason we were getting that error up here is it says we were trying to create a news post with a title and a body, but those weren't permitted up there. Okay, the params hash basically said it wasn't permitted at that point to go through. Okay, so now we replace this, okay, with news post params. Internally, the way that works, by the way, is params actually has a flag called permit or not, like permitted or not. And by doing this, you're basically flipping that flag as a programmer, saying, okay, we're going to allow this stuff through now. And now that we've allowed this stuff, okay, that's going to now take it in as okay. Okay, so this should work now. Hopefully, I haven't made any typos or forgotten anything major. So let's go back to /news/new, and we'll say what else was yesterday? American Sniper, big baby, news post, and there we go. And there it is. Okay, so pretty sweet now. We have a web app that's actually affecting a database, and this is persistent, right? You can see how now This is a web application, right? It's as powerful as a desktop application. This is what we call full stack, right? Because you have the web page at the top end and you have the database at the back end. That's all interactive. Okay? So that's that. Next week, what we're going to do is we'll finish off by doing something here. Then we'll do the edit and update, which is very similar, by the way. And then we'll do destroy, which is really simple. And that's it, I think. And then our Rails resource is complete. Okay? And again, the take-home message here is that when you design Ruby on Rails applications, you want to design your Ruby on Rails application as much around RESTful resources. Okay? You want to, like, just like object-oriented programming, you want to design your software to be all around objects. Ruby on Rails says take that a step further, design all around objects that have these CRUD actions that are interacted through this way. Index, show, new, create, edit, update, destroy. Okay? Cool. Any questions? Sweet. Did you guys get it working? Sweet. Good to hear. Okay. All right. I will be around. I don't know if this room is taken after this. I think it is. Right?
No.
No? Okay. Well, I can hang around for a bit. I'm going to stop the Google Hangout, though.